The pro-Turkish proxy forces have begun to advance on Aleppo, the city that Putin has been bombarding with aerial bombardment, destroying. And by the way, many people compared Mariupol at one time to Aleppo, because it was also bombed very seriously. Bashar al-Assad and family flew to Moscow to see Putin. No power, no means? Why now? Is it a general geopolitical plan where the United States of America is involved? Or has Turkey chosen the right moment when the forces are weak, including the Russian forces? Because there are already so-called musicians, those who fought there, the Wagnerians, Surovikin was lost somewhere, and the forces, as I understand it, are not very equal. There is a lot of things here, and as always, some nuances are important, and some of these nuances are unknown to us. Well, let's start with the most important, but not the most important, but quite important. First of all, it was not the pro-Turkish forces that attacked Assad. It was pro-Turkish forces, and there are pro-Turkish puppets, and they are among the most non-combatant, and they waited until the last minute, and in the last 24 hours, they became active and attacked. Their forces are certainly relevant to Turkey. What do you mean related to Turkey? Because the rebel enclave, or rather not an enclave, this territory in Idlib province, it is in fact bordering Turkey. In fact, through Turkey was in one way or another its life support. But those groups that attacked, this is first of all Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, former Jebhat al-Nusra, former branch of al-Qaeda in Syria. They have relations with the Turks, but they are not their puppets. They are acting independently, although I do not rule out that the Turks had a certain understanding of what was going to happen, and the Turks are not completely uninvolved in what is happening. As for the geopolitical plan of the United States is certainly not involved in any way. They perceived this organization as a terrorist organization, but today it may be less pronounced. Over the years, in one way or another, destroyed in any way, they do not support this organization, never supplied their weapons. However, they support some, and have supported some of those who are now attacking the Syrian army, has become about Surprise 27, after more than 4 years of a lull in the relative civil war in Syria, when the rebels, the main ones here are these rebel groups, and separately pro-Turkish forces along the border were pinned down in a small area near the city of Idlib, the provincial center. A surprise attack began. The Middle East is fraught with surprises. What can I say? Sometimes they are unpleasant. This one is not unpleasant at all, and the question is, who is? They've been preparing. The group's commander, its head, Julani, is a talented organizer and quite a serious commander by the standards of Syrian realities. He has worked hard to improve both the local production of the military and the combat effectiveness of his forces, as well as building a less solid alliance with those who are not part of his subgroup, but are willing to act in solidarity. They achieved the effect of surprise absolute, as it turned out. The defense of Assad's forces, their allies, Russia, Lebanese Hezbollah, its Iran and pro-Iranian forces. The defense was very fluid, based on uncounted forces that were not ready either in terms of motivational or combat readiness. For me, it came as all of a sudden.
Это ливанская Хизбалла, это Иран и проиранские силы. Оборона была очень жидкой, базировалась на, в общем-то, относительно немногочисленных силах, которые не были готовы с точки зрения ни мотивационной, ни с точки зрения боевой готовности на техническом уровне. И тут для меня, например, это стало все неожиданно. До сих пор...
Until a few years ago, what had been happening there was shelling, strikes, some small raids, but now there was an offensive, a full-scale, major rebel offensive that was not expected. The enemy missed, and his intelligence, there were no forces ready to put up significant resistance. Right now, we're seeing the collapse of the front in northern Syria. The city of Aleppo is very large. There are already jokes and memes going around about how the Russians were taught to take the city in 3 days, along the lines of Kiev in 3 days. The city, by the way, is much more populated than Kiev. Apparently, it has 4 to 5 million inhabitants at the moment. The moment has accumulated, although it is not very clear to me how it can happen there. Just in such quantities, it is a huge city of great importance, the largest in Syria. And it is important to understand that in the Syrian civil war, cities are the main clues. Because in the desert on the open ground, fighting does not last long if one side has an advantage. So if the side takes even a medium-sized city, or even a large city, or at least part of a large, you can stay here for years. You have correctly pointed out that what Mariupol learned, Aleppo learned, and other cities in Syria learned as well. When Russian aviation began operating in Syria, there was not even an element of any attempt to comply with minimal international humanitarian rules. On the contrary, the actions were carried out solely for the local population, and those who resisted to leave the cities, that is, hospitals, sewage systems, bakeries, and so on, were taken out on purpose. And at the initial stage, people were questioning when they saw these videos, trying to understand maybe it was an accident, maybe they were just bombing randomly and it came here. No, as time went on, the pattern became very clear. And Aleppo became a symbol for years. Literally inside Aleppo there was street fighting. There's some sides control this, others control that. And today, rebel groups have taken over much of the territory they never controlled. They are advancing not only in the city, but in other areas. Pro-Turkish forces have also joined in, but their main opponent is not the Assad regime, but the Kurds. The Kurds are also present in Aleppo, and the rebels also have Kurds as an enemy in this area. The Kurds themselves perceive the Assad regime as neutral but hostile. In general, not everything is simple there. The question today is, when the collapse of Assad's forces is over, where will the rebels have time to reach? They are moving very fast. Hour after hour, we are receiving reports of the capture and confirmed capture of a new city, for which there have been years of terrible battles in the past decade. The question is, what will Russia, Iran, and pro-Iranian forces do? The situation of Russia, pro-Iranian forces, and Iran is not the most pleasant in the light of the general geopolitical and military situation. Russia has problems in Ukraine, the Iranians have very serious problems, Hezbollah has been hit hard. The situation is very interesting, and what is also interesting is that Assad's forces and their allies have suffered very heavy losses. It is already confirmed now. We can probably talk about almost hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment. I mean, a couple of hundred. If we are talking artillery, tanks, APCs, BMPs, trucks, I mean, only captured intact. If before Russia could easily bring its supplies, plus the Syrian army had supplies, Russia could bring old weapons and new ones to Syria and not feel the problem. Today, it is stripping off the T-55 tanks from Mosfilm for itself. This is where President Assad is failing. Another thing, Assad's departure to Moscow is not quite clear. It should not be taken directly as him fleeing Syria before the Assad regime is completely defeated is still a long way off, and I very much doubt it will be on the agenda. Especially since the Iranians will try to intervene at any cost, and Damascus is a long way away. There are no problems around Damascus yet, and Assad, even in the most difficult times, much more difficult than now, has not shown such cowardice in terms of fleeing the country and all to hell. So if he went to Russia, it's probably not because he ran away, it's because he's trying to negotiate some urgent help. David, there is information that for the first time since 2016, Russian Federation aviation has started bombing Aleppo again. By the way, you were talking about Russia's tactics. Absolutely brutal, cynical, terrorist, that they were just destroying the city so that civilians would flee. The same thing they're doing now in Kharkiv, first of all, and Odessa. because the CUBs, the S-300s, are flying in there as well. Undoubtedly. Only there is one difference. The difference is of a technical nature. Russian aircraft cannot fly freely over Kharkiv and Odessa, and they sometimes drop some munitions there. And over Syria, they flew with impunity for years, because the only thing the enemy had was man-portable air defense systems. So they flew at medium altitudes and dropped bombs wherever they wanted, day after day, year after year. So did the government forces aviation, and even helicopters, being at an altitude beyond the reach of ridiculous anti-aircraft weapons, just hovered over the place and dropped barrels of explosives. The fact that the Ukrainian air defense did not allow the Russian aviation, from the beginning of the war, to operate directly on the territory of Ukraine, and the maximum was to throw munitions and launch them from a great distance, is one of the main reasons for the success of the Ukrainians in the defense, in the offensive, and the fact that in general, they managed to save a lot. I mean, logistics and cities that have not been destroyed and so on. The Syrian rebels did not have such opportunities. They experienced what is called the full and complete during that main stage of the war, starting in 2015, the use of Russian and Syrian aircraft against them.